Hi, welcome to U.S. History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're talking about Chapter 12, Antebellum Culture and Reform. This is the second part of this video, and it's going to focus specifically on abolitionism and feminism. With that out of the way, let's get into it. So, if we're going to talk about the movement to abolish slavery, we should probably start with a high-level look at the state of slavery in 1830. The United States was home to just under 13 million people, and about 2 million of those people were enslaved. At this point, there were 12 slave states where slavery was totally legal, and 12 free states where slavery was more or less illegal. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise had made this division explicitly geographic by drawing a straight line across the country and saying everything south of there was open to slavery and everything north of there was not. That compromise had solved the immediate political crisis, but a decade later, people still had a wide range of opinions about slavery and about what, if anything, should be done about it. In the South, the vast majority of white people supported slavery. We talked about this extensively in Chapter 11, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. In the North, slavery was more controversial. Factory owners depended on the slave economy for cheap cotton to feed their textile mills. Merchants made money shipping cotton across the Atlantic to Europe, and bankers who did business with the South knew that if slavery went away, the planters would never be able to pay back their loans, and the banks would lose money. If those all sound like rich people problems to you, yes, that's correct. The upper class in the North was deeply tied to the upper class in the South financially. But there were also pro-slavery sympathies among working-class Northerners as well. People feared that if slavery ended, free black people would pour into northern cities and take their jobs, or at the very least, lower wages. It's a similar economic anxiety to what we talked about with nativism back in Chapter 10, just directed at black people instead of immigrants. Having said that, though, many Northerners did actually oppose slavery, often on moral grounds. This group had already basically ended slavery in the North, they'd banned the importation of more enslaved people, and they'd forced a compromise on the expansion of slavery into the territories. However, the movement to end slavery nationwide had sort of hit a brick wall when it tried to expand into the slave states. It was obvious that the local organizing that had worked for them in the North was just not going to work in the South. So, the opponents of slavery found themselves looking for a new strategy. One option came in the form of colonization. In 1816, a group from the Upper South, led by our old pal Henry Clay, had formed an organization called the American Colonization Society. Their goal was to set up a colony in West Africa for formerly enslaved African Americans. This was pitched as a moderate solution to some of the objections people had with ending slavery outright. See, if black people were freed and then sent to this colony, nobody had to worry about black people taking their jobs or moving into their communities or, God forbid, asking for equality. That would all be someone else's problem, because the newly freed black people would be 5,000 miles away on the other side of the ocean. There were, however, a couple of problems with this plan. For one thing, the ACS never had anything like the resources it would have needed to actually accomplish these goals. They did establish a colony that would eventually become the nation of Liberia, but according to the AMSCO book, the ACS only ever settled about 12,000 people in Africa. They really weren't even putting a dent in the total enslaved population of over 2 million. But there was a deeper problem here, which was that black Americans didn't actually want to live in Liberia. Colonization as a concept was based on this idea that black people are from Africa, but by this point, most African Americans were actually born here. Their home wasn't in West Africa, it was in South Carolina. Now, before I get to this last problem with colonization, I want to introduce a new character. In 1829, William Lloyd Garrison was working as co-editor of an anti-slavery newspaper. At this job, he read and published the arguments that black abolitionists like William Watkins were making against colonization. By 1831, Garrison became convinced that colonization was not a solution to slavery. In fact, it was not even intended to be a solution to slavery. He believed that the true purpose of colonization was to strengthen slavery by removing the growing free black population of the South, before the remaining enslaved population started getting any ideas about what freedom would actually look like. Instead of colonization, Garrison advocated for the immediate, uncompensated, nationwide abolition of slavery. And it's worth taking a second to walk through those 4 points to kind of outline what the difference is between abolition and all of the anti-slavery positions that we've seen in previous episodes. So immediate should be self-explanatory. This contrasted with the gradual emancipation laws that had ended slavery in the North over the course of several decades. Uncompensated means that the enslavers should not be given financial compensation for their loss of property when black people were freed. For example, when Britain ended slavery in 1833, the government allocated £20 million to pay out to former enslavers. Garrison would not accept this. Nationwide, again, should be self-explanatory, but it is worth pointing out that the abolitionists were not just trying to prevent slavery in the North or in the territories. They were coming for slavery in the South as well. And finally, abolition itself. See, emancipation is about freeing individual people. Abolition is about changing the law to make slavery completely illegal. Garrison was so influential in this movement that historians often date the start of abolition to 1831, when Garrison started publishing his own newspaper, The Liberator. But Garrison was far from alone here. He made a point of working directly with the black anti-slavery community as well. In its first year, 90% of the Liberator's subscribers were African American, and throughout the paper's run, Garrison frequently published articles written by black men like Frederick Douglass and David Ruggles. In 1833, Garrison led an effort to create an organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society, which would become the center of all abolitionist organizing nationwide. Interestingly, Garrison was not technically the leader of this society. His skills were more as a writer and a speaker than as an organizer or an administrator, so the job of president went to a man named Arthur Tappan. The meeting where the AASS was founded also included a woman named Lucretia Mott and 3 other female Quakers. These women were not allowed to directly participate, though, because at the time it was seen as socially unacceptable for women to speak in front of an audience if that audience included men. But more than just who they were, we should also be asking ourselves, what did these people actually, do about slavery? Their first tactic was something called moral suasion, which essentially means convincing people that slavery is bad and they should stop doing it. To make this work, abolitionists needed to get their argument in front of a lot of people, and they did that with all of the technologies and cultural institutions that we talked about last time. You want newspapers? The abolitionists loved newspapers. Garrison had a newspaper. Douglass had a newspaper. The AASS had its own newspaper. If you hated slavery and you could afford a printing press, you probably had a newspaper too. Remember how Ralph Waldo Emerson spread his ideas through lecture tours? Well, his hometown actually established its own anti-slavery society in 1837 in response to a series of guest lectures by the abolitionist Angelina Grimke. Angelina and her sister Sarah had been born into a slaveholding family in South Carolina, but as adults, they both became major figures in the abolition movement. Lectures like this also served to link the American anti-slavery community with the British one. Abolitionists from both countries regularly crossed the ocean to lecture in front of new audiences. And there was another important way that abolitionists got their message out there. Articles and speeches are all well and good, but it's another thing entirely to read a first-hand account where someone says, "This happened to me personally." Fugitive slave narratives like the ones by Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup, which we talked about in Chapter 11, offer pretty convincing arguments against slavery by just giving a frank account of how bad things actually were. Douglass and Northup wrote these books themselves, but in many cases abolitionists were involved in the publication of fugitive slave narratives for the simple reason that people who escaped from slavery didn't know how to read or write. Weirdly, the most popular book in this vein was actually a work of fiction, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This book portrayed the cruelties of slavery in a way that resonated with people well beyond the abolitionists' normal core audience. It sold 300,000 copies in the United States in its first year, and it got adapted into a stage play which reached an even broader audience. But abolitionists weren't just writing down the stories from fugitive slaves. They were personally helping those fugitives escape to freedom in the first place. The so-called Underground Railroad was not literally a railroad, but rather a secret network of free black people, abolitionists, and their allies who would hide fugitive slaves and give them food and transportation to get them on to the next station along the track. This process often carried people as far north as Canada. There are 2 major figures we need to talk about here. The first is Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery in 1849 and spent the 1850s sneaking back into the South to lead other people out. By the end of the decade, she had made 13 trips and freed about 70 more people. The second person we want to discuss is William Still, a free black man who lived in Philadelphia and served as a key organizer of the Underground Railroad there. still kept detailed records of the fugitives who passed through his care, including their names, their appearance, and their stories. I'll link to a PBS documentary about him in the description, and I'll summarize one of the stories here. A group of 8 people fled slavery in Maryland and started north along the Underground Railroad. In Delaware, one of their supposed protectors turned them in to the local sheriff for a $3,000 reward. Not willing to go back without a fight, the group smashed through a window, jumped out, climbed the fence around the jail, and fled into the night. My understanding is that at least 6 of them eventually made it to freedom. That story is a reminder that all of this activity with the Underground Railroad was actually illegal. Abolitionists were risking prison time, or worse if you were black like Still was, to help other people escape to freedom. But as amazing as the Underground Railroad was, it wasn't anywhere close to enough. If the movement was going to succeed, they were going to have to make massive changes to the law as well. There was, in fact, still work to be done in the North. Black abolitionists in particular often focused on winning citizenship and voting rights for black men. They actually succeeded in gaining the right to vote in Rhode Island in 1843. But obviously, the real goal was the end of slavery in the South. The problem was that Southern state governments didn't care what abolitionists thought, and the federal government was not legally allowed to end slavery in states where it already existed. The good news here was that the federal government absolutely could ban slavery in places that weren't states, specifically D.C. and the territories. For the moment, I want us to focus on Washington, D.C. You see, abolitionists saw it as an affront to everything that America stood for that slavery persisted in the nation's capital. They attacked this problem by creating petitions and then having members of local chapters go around town and get signatures before sending them off to Congress. All in all, anti-slavery societies sent over 600,000 petitions to Congress and various state governments covering this topic and others. The sheer volume of petitions was so great that even Congress had to do something about it. And for this unusual occasion, we turn to the What the Textbook Doesn't Tell You section. So, what did Congress do in response to this massive outpouring of anti-slavery sentiment? Did they abolish slavery in D.C.? Maybe pass some kind of gradual emancipation law? No. In 1836, the House created something called the Gag Rule, which said that anti-slavery petitions could no longer be read in Congress at all. In 1840, they strengthened it to say that they would no longer even formally receive any petition dealing with the abolition of slavery, just straight from the people's hands directly into the trash can. Paradoxically, in some ways, this was actually a gift for the abolition movement. All of a sudden, this wasn't just about slavery anymore. It was about the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, something that's explicitly guaranteed in black and white in the First Amendment. Abolitionists had long argued that their crusade against slavery was also a fight against tyranny more broadly, and here was their proof. Southern congressmen were literally preventing their northern colleagues from even acknowledging the concerns of the people they represented. All of a sudden, the argument that slavery was un-American and undemocratic started making way more sense. At this time, John Quincy Adams was serving as a representative from Massachusetts. He was not really an abolitionist per se, but he despised the gag rule, and he made it his personal mission to make the people who supported and enforced it look like idiots on the national stage. He became more and more vocally anti-slavery as time went on, eventually becoming the leader of an anti-slavery faction within the Whig Party called the Conscience Whigs. Hilariously, abolitionists responded to all of this by petitioning Congress to undo the gag rule so that they could go back to petitioning Congress to end slavery. In the end, the House eventually would end the gag rule in 1844. So, what do we make of all of that? On the one hand, the pro-slavery crowd had prevented Congress from hearing petitions to end slavery in D.C. for nearly a decade. But on the other hand, their ultimate goal had been to stamp out the abolition movement before it got too powerful. And in that way, they had clearly failed. Abolition had started as a tiny radical movement that only mattered in its home region. Now, it was very much part of the national conversation, and it was getting political support from an ex-president. Unfortunately for abolitionists, the gag rule was very much not the only backlash the movement was going to suffer. You see, in the same year that Garrison started publishing The Liberator, an enslaved man named Nat Turner led the bloodiest slave revolt in American history. These two events became permanently linked in the Southern consciousness. People came to believe that the stakes of stopping abolition were literally life and death. In their mind, if Garrison had his way, there would be a Nat Turner in every county from Maryland to Louisiana, and no white man, woman, or child would be safe anywhere in the South. When abolitionists began a mass mailing campaign to spread their ideas into the South in 1835, Southern state governments responded by making it illegal to distribute abolitionist literature. Georgia in particular made the circulation of abolitionist pamphlets punishable by death, and in situations where the government was not aggressive enough, citizens would sometimes solve this problem on their own with mob violence. In the North, the state governments were obviously less hostile, but acts of violence against abolitionists were still shockingly common. In 1835, William Lloyd Garrison was attacked by a mob in his hometown of Boston and only escaped with the help of local police. In Illinois in 1837, a mob attacked another abolitionist printer named Elijah P. Lovejoy. They destroyed his printing press and they killed him. In 1838, the second annual meeting of the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women was set to happen in Philadelphia. During the first day of the convention, a mob surrounded the building and started smashing in the windows. Attendee Caroline Brooks described the scene, quote, "This, with the howling, screeching, and screaming, oaths and yells without, carriages rolled around the building to make a noise, the false alarm of fire screamed in every direction, glass rattling, etc., made a most terrific scene." End quote. Eventually, the mob left, and the women were able to escape. The convention was canceled, but the following day the mob returned anyway and burned the building to the ground. Surprisingly, not all of the opposition to abolition came from the pro-slavery side. American nationalists, with no specific interest in slavery one way or the other, saw abolition as a threat to the Union itself. The South was already toying with ideas like nullification and secession because of tariff policy. Why make that situation even worse by starting a fight over an even more controversial issue? Abolitionists also had some self-inflicted wounds in this period. We're going to talk about the biggest disagreement, the one that literally split the movement in two, and if you remember the other topic I said this video was going to cover, you can probably guess what this issue was. So, before we talk about feminism, we should run through at a high level what society thought about women in the 1830s and 40s. You see, the dominant understanding of gender roles at this time held that the world was divided into two separate spheres. The masculine sphere was public and outward-facing. It was the man's job to go out and make money, participate in politics, fight in wars, etc. The feminine sphere was domestic and inward-facing. The woman's job was to take care of the home, raise children, prepare food, and things like that. You'll sometimes also hear this idea of women's roles referred to as the cult of domesticity, basically rewarding women for being good at homemaking and shunning the ones who couldn't or didn't fit that mold. There were even special magazines at this time, like Godey's Ladies' Book, which discussed specifically feminine topics like fashion and homemaking, and deliberately avoided traditionally masculine topics like politics. Now, you might notice that this ideal femininity is built on the assumption that your husband is going to make enough money to provide for you and your kids. But what if you never get married? What if your husband dies or loses his job? What if your husband is alive and has a job, but it just doesn't pay very well? In situations like that, women realistically had to find work, and that was getting increasingly difficult as factory work became more and more closely associated with the masculine sphere. Women typically found work as nurses or domestic servants, but even in these acceptably feminine jobs, proper society still looked down on you for having to get a job in the first place. The result of all of this was that the ideal of femininity was not realistically achievable for most women in the working class, which included the vast majority of black women and female immigrants. But it's not like things were great for middle-class white women either. They could achieve the ideal, but only if they agreed to spend their entire lives within this narrowly defined sphere. That's why a lot of early feminism was about pushing the boundaries of that sphere so that the things women wanted and needed to do could become socially acceptable. In this pursuit, feminism actually built off of the work done by earlier reform movements. We talked in the first part of this chapter about how the women in the temperance movement stepped outside their traditional sphere to push for social reform. Abolitionist women carried that even further. Like I mentioned, the Grimkes were traveling and lecturing about abolition, Lucretia Mott had been involved in the American Anti-Slavery Society from the very beginning, and I should also mention Sojourner Truth, She was born into slavery in New York and eventually became a prominent advocate for the rights of both enslaved people and women. On top of that, remember those petition campaigns we talked about? Well, most of the people who signed those petitions and did the actual work of getting other people to sign them were women. In Concord, Massachusetts, for example, it wasn't even close. Women provided about 70% of all the signatures. But just because women were already doing a lot of work to help the movement, that didn't mean that everyone was on board with it. You see, abolition, like most of the big reform movements in this period, was deeply tied to religion, and Christian doctrine at the time strongly supported the gender roles that we just talked about. In their view, lecturing, organizing, and petitioning the government were all men's work. Importantly for our story, they also believed that it was unnatural for women to hold leadership positions that gave them authority over men. As women got more and more involved in abolition, many of them had become frustrated that they could do all the work they wanted in their separate female anti-slavery societies, but when it came to the broader movement, their voices were being completely ignored. William Lloyd Garrison sided with the women on this, pushing the American Anti-Slavery Society to allow women to vote in their internal elections in 1839. The following year, they elected a woman named Abby Kelly to their business committee. Now, there had always been tensions between Garrison's radical vision of abolitionism and the more moderate anti-Garrisonian faction. But for the moderates, electing a woman into a position of authority was the final straw. They walked out of the convention and never came back. This question of women's rights continued to divide the abolitionist community. Garrison and his allies saw empowering women as critical to the movement's success. As Garrison himself put it, quote, "I wrong the slave in dishonoring or casting one obstacle in the way of his female advocate," end quote. But many abolitionists, including some women, believed that whether it was good strategy or not, women were not supposed to act like men. End of story. At the same time, there were moderates who believed that this issue was just too controversial. They were going to drive people away from abolition if they insisted on women's rights too. And in fact, the movement's enemies did frequently play up how radical the abolitionists were by associating them with the most radical version of every other social reform movement. Virginian intellectual George Fitzhugh wrote, quote, "We treat the abolitionists and socialists as identical, because they are notoriously the same people, employing the same arguments and bent on the same schemes. Abolition is the first step in socialism. The former proposes to abolish Negro slavery, the latter all kinds of slavery, religion, government, marriage, families, property, nay, human nature itself." End quote. In the end, whether it was good politics or not, abolition had already become tied to the budding feminist movement. After the American Anti-Slavery Society formally split, but still in 1840, there was a worldwide anti-slavery conference in London. The Garrisonian delegation included a number of women. After a heated debate, the conference voted to send the women away on the grounds that, they had cooties, and their goofy 19th century dresses would get in the way of doing abolition. One of the delegates, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, took this personally. She became a leading voice for women's rights in America, eventually organizing the country's first major feminist conference in Seneca Falls in 1848. This conference hosted some of the leading women of the day, including both Stanton and Mott, as well as a number of men, including Frederick Douglass. Like Garrison, Douglass saw abolition and feminism as intrinsically linked. His newspaper, the North Star, carried the following tagline to reflect that reality. Quote, "Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and all we are brethren." End quote. The major output of the Seneca Falls Convention was a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was designed to mirror the Declaration of Independence and link feminism to the existing tradition of American support for liberty and equality. For example, the text on screen is from the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to read the corresponding section from the Declaration of Sentiments. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Where the Declaration of Independence follows this preamble with 27 grievances of the colonies against King George, the Declaration of Sentiments follows with 16 grievances of woman against man. I encourage you to read them for yourself, but the short version is basically 1. He has denied her the right to vote. 2. He has made her legally subservient to her husband. 3. He has denied her direct access to wealth, status, education, and positions in the government, the church, and most other highly respected professions. And finally, this one I'll quote directly, quote, he has endeavored, in every way that he could, to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. End quote. Now, that document focuses on specific concrete problems with existing laws and social customs. Another important feminist work, the book Woman in the 19th Century by Margaret Fuller, takes a more theoretical look at the concept of separate spheres itself. Fuller, a transcendentalist, argues that masculinity and femininity are real and distinct things, but human beings don't ever fall cleanly into just one category. Quote, male and female represent the two sides of the great radical dualism, but in fact, they are perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens to solid, solid rushes to fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman. End quote. Fuller's critique of the idea of separate spheres focuses on the separate part. In her mind, that strict separation between masculine and feminine is arbitrary, and it's harmful. She argues that the solution is simply to allow people to fall wherever they fall in relation to the two spheres. Quote, we would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. Were this done, and a slight temporary fermentation allowed to subside, we should see crystallizations more pure and of more various beauty. We believe the divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in the history of former ages, and that no discordant collision, but a ravishing harmony of the spheres would ensue. End quote. In summary, American feminism was really just getting started at this point. Most of the big developments in terms of the law and voting rights were still decades away. However, this period was still important because it laid a lot of the groundwork for those future victories. All of the skills that women learned in order to recruit and fight for abolition would translate pretty directly to feminist action later on. For example, Susan B. Anthony, the most famous figure in the eventual movement for women's suffrage, got her start in abolition. But while feminism wasn't as central to the political conversation in this period as the fight against slavery was, women were still making actual progress. The very act of having prominent women giving lectures in public, talking and writing about politics, and actively working for social change put a real dent in that idea that a woman's sphere had to be totally limited to her home and her family. And for a change on a more personal level, I'll quote the textbook here. Quote, friendships among women became increasingly intense, end quote. If you're familiar with the memes about what historians mean when they say that two women were very good friends, yeah, there's evidence that some of these women were in romantic relationships with each other. But think about it this way. If you were a woman at this time who chafed against the restrictions of the cult of domesticity, reform movements like feminism, abolition, and temperance did actually give you a chance to expand your social circles and make friends with other women who felt the same way you did. Sometimes that was romantic, but sometimes it was just two people bonding because they shared similar experiences and similar worldviews. And that was something that probably wouldn't have happened if these women's social circles had been limited to just their families and their neighbors. So that brings us to why this matters in the 21st century. A couple of months ago, comedian Jon Stewart returned as a part-time host of The Daily Show. His first monologue focused mainly on the 2024 election, but he ended with something that I think is really important.
And it's all going to make you feel like Tuesday, November 5th is the only day that matters. And that day does matter. But man, November 6th ain't nothing to sneeze at, or November 7th. If your guy loses, bad things might happen. But the country is not over. And if your guy wins, the country is in no way saved. I've learned one thing over these last 9 years, and I was glib at best and probably dismissive at worst about this. The work of making this world resemble one that you would prefer to live in is a lunch pail job, day in and day out, where thousands of committed, anonymous, smart, and dedicated people bang on closed doors and pick up those that are fallen and grind away on issues till they get a positive result. And even then, have to stay on to make sure that result holds. So the good news is, I'm not saying you don't have to worry about who wins the election. I'm saying you have to worry about every day before it and every day after, forever.
To me, that sounds a lot like the reform movements we talked about today. In this chapter, we saw William Lloyd Garrison work towards abolition for 30 years, and he still hasn't gotten there yet. We talked about the first steps of the feminist movement at a time when they're still 75 years away from getting the right to vote. These are generational struggles, so if there's one that you care about and you have the chance to get involved, there is no time like the present. If you want a better world 20 years from now, you've got to start today. And I want to leave you with two specific thoughts about that. First of all, you are not alone. William Lloyd Garrison was not the first person to come up with the idea that slavery was bad, and he was not the last person to fight for racial equality. When you join a generational reform movement, you get to build on the work of everyone who came before you, and you get to set up an easier road to victory for everyone who comes after you. This is very much a team effort. Secondly, you do not have to be a world-class writer or public speaker to help make the world a better place. William Lloyd Garrison did both of those things, but the abolition movement didn't need 100,000 William Lloyd Garrisons. As much as it needed him, it also needed Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and eventually John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. It needed people who signed petitions and people who carried those petitions around their community. It needed people to coordinate scheduling and travel for all of the conventions they held. It needed financiers and accountants. It needed people who had suffered, who were willing to share their story with the world. And it needed artists who could hit people in the feels when their minds couldn't be changed any other way. Never feel like you don't have the skills to make the world a better place. Whatever skills you have can be used. And as long as you are willing to put in the work, a lot of the skills that you don't have can be learned. I want to close out here by quoting the end of the Declaration of Sentiments. In entering upon the great work before us, we anticipate no small amount of misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule. But we shall use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press in our behalf. We hope this convention will be followed by a series of conventions, embracing every part of the country. Firmly relying upon the final triumph of the right and the true, we do this day affix our signatures to this declaration. So yeah, that's it for chapter 12. I hope you found it helpful. Before I go, I want to do a quick shout out for two of my major sources from this video. The Slave's Cause by Manisha Sinha introduces you to all the major figures and events from the history of abolition. The Transcendentalists and Their World by Robert A. Gross does a fantastic job of laying out the economic and cultural shifts that were happening in this period, and it really shows how they affected the lives of individual people. I should mention, though, that both of these books are incredibly dense. If they sound interesting, absolutely check them out. Just be aware of what you're getting into. With that, I'll say join us next time for Chapter 13, The Impending Crisis. We're going to talk about politics, and it's going to get messy.